There's a lot of talk lately about what's being called the country's dropout crisis. The president wants the minimum dropout age raised to 18. That has created quite a bit of debate. But debate over these sorts of things is nothing new. As part of the 9 Network's American Graduate Initiative, Jim Kircher takes a look back to the day when requiring schooling at all was a hot issue.
The Missouri legislature passed a compulsory education law in 1901. It called for children who were not needed to work to support a family to go to school from age 8 to 14. Many celebrated this as a step forward, a long time in coming, and Alexander Dockery, Missouri's first 20th century governor, promptly vetoed it. There was plenty of opposition to compulsory education for familiar reasons. There were religious, rural, and urban divisions, concern about costs, more students meant building more schools and hiring more teachers, and concerns about constitutional rights.
That the state is taking over the responsibility of parents and dictating what children needed to learn.
4 years later, a new governor with a completely different point of view signed it into law. For Joseph Folk, the country itself was at stake. He said the state did have the right to demand the education of its future citizens. The penal institutions, he said, were already filled with the ignorant and uneducated. For every dollar a state spends in the cause of education, he argued, it gets back 10 in lessened criminal costs. He would find many today making the same argument.
Our prisons are filled with high school dropouts.
We either modify the child today or we manage that same adult tomorrow.
Today it is said that a high school dropout is 8 times as likely as a graduate to end up in prison. And a job, well, you've got to have at least high school and even better vocational training or college. But 100 years ago, that really wasn't the case. Today you need education to get into the workforce. Back then, compulsory education was going to keep kids out of the workforce. Uneducated kids could easily find work in this growing industrial and urban world. You could see them every day on the streets, selling papers, working on delivery wagons, and going into and out of factories. These photos were taken by Lewis Hine, who traveled the country documenting child labor, and he had plenty of subjects in St. Louis. There were the newsies, some of whom didn't just work on the streets, but lived on the streets. He photographed these girls leaving their jobs at the Brown Shoe Factory, and these boys who were working at the Obernester Glass Factory in East St. Louis. The captions often point out how many of the boys are smoking.
He, in many cases, had to sneak into factories and into coal areas, into glass factories and mines to get these pictures and to publicize them, both to bring to light the conditions, sometimes the ages under which children were working, and also to show the spirit of these children. In some cases, to show the cost of what was at stake if we don't, in effect, save these children now.
In 1904, as the city was preparing to welcome the world to its fair with exhibits of advanced technology and a model classroom, the papers carried news of a terrible tragedy. 9 people were killed when they fell down an elevator shaft at the end of a shift at the Brown Shoe Factory. The report said the victims included 1 man and 8 boys. The oldest was 16, the youngest was about to turn 11. When Governor Folk signed Missouri's compulsory education bill the following year, he also signed into law restrictions on child labor.
Prior to this time, children were considered little adults, and they were treated as little adults. During this progressive era, at the end of the 19th century, we began to think about children as needing a special, different kind of development, and schools would offer children the opportunity to have the kind of care and opportunities that they needed.
Hein took this photograph of child workers in Massachusetts, capturing both weariness and playfulness. Progressive-era reformers were convincing cities like St. Louis to build playgrounds, bathhouses, clean up the slums, and get kids off the streets and into schools. They believed it would mean better citizens and a safer city. And for many, it still does.
Kids that are more educated, adults that are more educated, are more healthy. They're less likely to be incarcerated, more likely to be employed. They're more productive adults. They are better parents, and all the things that we can think of.
We are a strong nation because we are a literate nation. Literacy affects how well our country can do. So it's always...
They're not quoting Joseph Folk, but they might as well be. Folk was a crusader. As St. Louis Circuit Attorney, he went after the boodlers, the rampant corruption at City Hall. They called him Holy Joe, and no wonder. He saw a world in constant conflict between good and evil, right and wrong, law and lawlessness, and education and ignorance. This is a Louis Hein photo of two St. Louis brothers. 12-year-old Meyer, it says, was a newsie who was working the streets until late at night, hanging out with bad associates, and stealing from stores. His little brother Abe, he just got out of reform school. In a 1906 speech, Governor Folk said it is more important that all of the people get some education than having some of the people get all of the education. And it wasn't just the politicians pushing for child labor and compulsory education laws. In many cases, they were responding to the public outcry and demand for change. And while it may not have come from the factory and business owners, it did often come from their wives. Well-to-do ladies and their clubs got deeply involved, venturing into issues and neighborhoods they could have just as easily ignored.
In ways that really challenged them personally, and certainly frequently caused dissension in their households with their businessmen husbands, who they often were at odds with.
But they got results, first requiring schooling for all children, and then getting more and more into high school and vocational school. In 1900, just 6% of the nation's 17-year-olds were finishing some kind of secondary education. By 1930, what we call the graduation rate was up to 30%. It kept climbing in the post-war years, and in 1969, 8 out of 10 teenagers were graduating from high school. It's never gotten any higher. And with fewer and fewer jobs available to high school dropouts, today's graduation rate of around 72% is considered a national crisis. The biggest problems are in poor rural school districts and big cities, with African American and Hispanic students in particular having graduation rates running significantly below the national average. A challenge as daunting as what this country and this city faced in another era.
We can't look only at schools to find answers, because the problems are not only those of schools. These are issues, I think, that require community responses.